Aloha and welcome back to this Stick with the Winners class. I'm Ken B. and my dad and I have just recently written a book called Stick with the Winners, How to Conduct More Effective 12-Step Recovery Meetings Using Conference-Approved Literature. And this series of videos is designed to provide additional information and background for that book. This is video number 9, and in this video we're going to be talking about the original Akron AA Christian Fellowship program, which we have called, quote, Old School AA, end of quote. It consisted of 16 practices of the early pioneers. These 16 practices are sufficiently lengthy that we present them in 2 parts. So this is part 1, the first 8 of the 16 practices of Old School AA. Practice number 1 was qualifying the newcomer. Newcomers, and often their wives, were interviewed by Dr. Bob and other pioneer AAs to determine, A, if they had conceded that they had a seemingly uncontrollable, medically incurable alcohol problem, and B, if they had shown a desire to quit permanently, and C, if they had committed themselves to go to any length to stay sober. Number 2, hospitalization was a must. Newcomers were hospitalized for a period of some 5 to 7 days. Initially, they were medicated to prevent seizures and other problems. During this time, Dr. Bob would visit each extensively each day. Other sober alcoholics would tell the newcomer their stories. The Bible was the only reading material allowed in the hospital room, and Dr. Bob would read the Bible with the newcomers. And then Dr. Bob would offer the newcomer the opportunity to surrender before release from the hospital. The third practice, surrender by the newcomer before discharge from the hospital, and that was after his 7-day stay at the hospital. Before the newcomer was discharged from the hospital, Dr. Bob would conduct his final visit and require that the newcomer profess a belief in God. Not a God, but God. Then the newcomer was told to get out of his bed, get down on his knees, and pray with Dr. Bob, accepting Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior in the process. The fourth practice, the newcomer was taken to his first Oxford group meeting at the home of T. Henry and Clarice Williams upon being released from his brief hospitalization, at least in the case of Dr. Bob's sponsee, Clarence Snyder, whose story about this is on page 144 of the AA General Service Conference approved book, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And Dr. Bob gave the newcomer a Bible and told him to, quote, go out and fix drunks as an avocation, end of quote. This practice of telling the newcomer at the time he surrendered to God that he must go out and help other drunks was consistent from the very first days of AA. Practice number 5. Most newcomers went to live in the Smith residence or in the residences of other Akron people like Wally G. and Tom L. They stayed as long as needed in order to get steady in their path. Practice 6. There were Christian fellowship meetings every day, with Dr. Bob, his wife Ann, and Henrietta Seiberling very much involved. In fact, an entire chapter of Dick B's book, The Akron Genesis of Alcoholics Anonymous, tells in detail, quote, the spiritual infusion, end of quote, that Henrietta Seiberling brought to Bill and Bob at the beginning. Her spiritual contributions to early AA development included A, the Bible and other books she read and discussed, B, quote, the inspiring version of first century Christianity as it paralleled Christ's own methods, end of quote, and C, her emphasis on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, 1 Corinthians 13, the Gospel of John, 1 John, quote, "Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth," end of quote, from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 9, quote, "Thy will be done," end of quote, from the Lord's Prayer, quote, "Give me news, not views, quiet times, and the four absolutes, honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love." And the daily fellowshipping took place at the Smith home, Henrietta Seiberling's home, and the home of T. Henry and Clarice Williams. These daily meetings included individual and group Bible study, prayer, counseling and discussion, and quiet time observances. And the following personal stories in the Big Book illustrate the practice. One personal story put it this way, quote, "Then and only then, after a thorough indoctrination by 8 or 9 individuals, was I allowed to attend my first meeting. This first meeting was held in the living room of a home and was led by Bill D., the first man that Bill W. and Dr. Bob had worked with successfully. The meeting consisted of perhaps 8 or 9 alcoholics and 7 or 8 wives. It was different from the meetings now held. The big AA book had not been written, and there was no literature except various religious pamphlets. The meeting lasted an hour and closed with the Lord's Prayer. Every evening we would meet at the home of one of the members and would have coffee and donuts and spend a social evening. I spent a great deal of time with Dr. Bob whenever he had the time to spare, and in the homes of 2 or 3 people, trying to see how the family lived the program. Another personal story said, quote, "Then occurred the event that saved me. An alcoholic who was a doctor came to see me. He didn't talk like a preacher at all. The doctor imparted his knowledge to just a few other men at the time. Not more than 4 or 5. The visits from these men impressed me at once. I could see they were sober. The third man who came to see me was one of the greatest business getters his company had ever employed. From the top of the heap in a few years, his business was practically gone, he told me when he discovered the answer. You've been trying man's ways, and they always fail, he told me. You can't win unless you try God's way. In a few sentences, he made God seem personal to me, explained him as a being who was interested in me, the alcoholic, and that all I needed to do was be willing to follow his way, and that as long as I followed it, I would be able to overcome my desire for liquor. He went on talking and told me he had found the plan has a basis of love and the practice of Christ's injunction, quote, love thy neighbor as thyself, end of quote. That day I gave my will to God and asked to be directed, but I have never thought of something to do and then forget about. I very early came to see that there had to be a continual renewal of that simple deal with God, that I had to perpetually keep the bargain. So I began to pray, to place my problems in God's hands, end of quote. Another personal story said, quote, there were only 7 or 8 people in the group before me, and they all visited me during my period in the hospital. The very simple program they advised me to follow was that I should ask to know God's will for me for that one day, and then, to the best of my ability, to follow that. And at night, to express my gratefulness to God for the things that had happened to me during the day, end of quote. Another personal story said, no conviction was necessary to establish my status as a miserable failure at managing my own life. I began to read the Bible daily and to go over a simple devotional exercise as a way to begin each day. Gradually, I began to understand. I can remember the urge of the prodigal son to return to his father. But in those days, I had no one to whom I might take my troubles. Today, I have. Today, I have someone who will always hear me. I took my last drink in 1937." End of quote. Practice number 7. Dr. Bob's wife led a daily morning quiet time. In addition to these activities, each morning, alcoholics and their family members gathered at the Smith home for a quiet time conducted by Dr. Bob's wife, Ann. It included prayer, Bible reading, seeking guidance, and discussion of portions of Ann's personal journal. Practice number 8. There was also one regular meeting, a quote, Oxford group meeting, end of quote, each Wednesday at the home of T. Henry Williams, a meeting unlike any other Oxford group meeting. These meetings scarcely resembled conventional Oxford group meetings. Old-timers Wally and Annabelle G. said they had read a lot about the Oxford group meetings being held at the Mayflower in 1933, but that, quote, it wasn't until later that they realized the meeting at T. Henry's was sort of a clandestine lodge of the Oxford group, end of quote. Dorothy S.M., wife of Dr. Bob's sponsee Clarence S., observed in 1937 that the meeting was, quote, a regular, old-fashioned prayer meeting, end of quote. Dr. Bob's son, Robert R. Smitty Smith, in a telephone conversation with me, that is my dad, Dick B., from his home in Nocona, Texas, described the meetings as, quote, old-fashioned revival meetings, end of quote. Author Nan Robertson quoted Dr. Bob's son, Smitty, as follows, quote, it was kind of like an old-fashioned revival meeting, end of quote. Some called the group itself, quote, the Alcoholic Squad, end of quote. Rockefeller's investigator, Frank Amos, referred to the group as the, quote, self-styled alcoholic group of Akron, Ohio, end of quote. Dr. Bob called the group a, quote, Christian fellowship, end of quote. Frank Amos declared, quote, members did not want the movement connected directly or indirectly with any religious movement or cult. They stressed the point that they had no connection whatever with any so-called Orthodox religious denomination or with the Oxford movement. Obviously, Amos meant the Oxford group, end of quote. As to this regular weekly meeting, old-timer Bob E. stated, quote, Dr. Bob and T. Henry, quote, teamed, end of quote, the meeting. T. Henry took care of the prayers with which the meeting was opened and closed. Quote, there were only a half dozen in the Oxford group. We, the alcoholics, had more than that. Sometimes we'd go downstairs and have our meeting, and the Oxford group would have theirs in the sitting room, end of quote. This, quote, regular meeting, end of quote, became the King School AA group in Akron. That followed the break with the Oxford group people in 1939, which transitioned into the, quote, regular, end of quote, meeting at Dr. Bob's home, which was full to overflowing before long. Then it moved to the King's School group in Akron. And here, based on the recollections of AA old-timer Duke P., are some snippets as to how, quote, the old school, end of quote, AA continued in Akron even after the Big Book was published, but while Dr. Bob and Ann Smith were still very much involved. The first point, the meetings were held in an assembly room that contained tables and chairs. There was no podium, so the meeting leader stood at the head of one of the tables. Next point, for the first 25 to 30 minutes, the chairperson would, quote, qualify, end of quote. Next, after the, quote, lead, end of quote, the chairperson opened the meeting for discussion. During this period, anyone could say anything that was on his or her mind. Dr. Bob's wife, Ann Ripley Smith, always spoke about some aspect of the program or commented on how the speaker's story had personally affected her. Dr. Bob spoke during some, but not all, of these discussion periods. Another point, no one read from the Big Book. Once in a while, the chairperson would read something from the Bible, if the passage related directly to his story. Duke remembered one chairperson reading from the book of James, and Dr. Bob's reading 1 Corinthians 13. Next point. Everyone dressed up for the meeting. All the men wore a coat and tie, done out of respect for AA, and as a demonstration that their lives had changed as a result of being, quote, on the program, end of quote. And the final point, no refreshments were served and no basket was passed. There was no charge for the use of the King's School. Prior to 1946, Akron AA had published a manual for Alcoholics Anonymous. It contained the following description of the newcomer's plan of action as soon as he was out of the hospital. Quote, "First off, your day will have a new pattern. You will open the day with a quiet time. This will be explained by your sponsor. You will read, quote, the upper room, end of quote, or whatever you think best for yourself. You will say a little prayer, asking for help during the day. Finally, at the end of the day, you will say another little prayer of thanks and gratitude for a day of sobriety." So that's the conclusion of the first 8 of the 16 practices in early AA in Akron.